some very strong conclusions. Okay, so what we've got here is a 3-column sort of diagram from his first journal article. Okay, the left is a musical category in question. The middle column represents Western art music, and the right column represents popular, vernacular, or folk music. So I'm just going to read out a couple examples, and then we're going to do the next thing. So, for example, we've got mode of construction. Okay, this is the category. Mode of construction. In classical music, the mode of construction is composed. We would say jazz, as the article is about. The mode of construction is improvised. That's this. The mode of presentation is a repeated performance in classical music. Jazz music, a single performance. Mode of understanding, syntactic. Because he took down a big fear. Don't worry about it. So here it is, the theory of participatory discrepancies. I'm just going to talk through this stuff. And maybe I'll put that right. Right, so the idea is that what creates a groove, right? This is the question we're asking. What makes you want to get up and dance? Okay, micro differences in tuning and timing and timbre are what give feeling and create groove. That's a huge statement. That's the idea that it's not perfection in timing, it's not perfection in tuning, it's actually that people are a little bit off. Just a little bit off in just the right way. And they're in dialogue. That's why it's participatory and it's discrepant. They're not landing in the same place, they're just off. Right? And this is an egalitarian, often novice-friendly, highly social construction of perfection in music. Everybody gets to join in. Everybody gets down on the one. We can all clap on the one. Right? And it sounds best on the one when we all try to clap on the one, not because we actually land on a mathematically precise one. It confronts the idea that emotion in music is something that is held and then released in applause, but that it can also be an unfolding process and a feedback loop, building in unpredictable ways. So there you go. You can just imagine your night down at the jazz club, it gets more and more exciting, or something changes, or something is awful, right? Whereas in contrast to you go to the opera and you know you're going to sit and you wait, and everybody's standing and clapping, right? And that's very different than like shouting out in joy in the middle of a song. Totally different mode. It troubles the idea that the best music will only exist just out of reach, in the mind of perhaps a dead composer, or in the hands of only elite experts. The best music might actually be possible unless we are imperfect. So the theory of PDs, for short, PDs, is emergent, processual, something one propels and builds with others, not an existing object. It's imitation, innovation as an ideal, not iteration, replication as an ideal. Okay. One more of these. Politically, the theory goes way beyond music when you begin to think about it. It's a very democratic sort of theory. Right? It's the idea that we create groove through consensus-making process. It's not a dictator passing down the composer to the lowly musicians. Right? This is a very communal notion that we are all working together as a team to express our individual contributions to the idea of being in time and in tune. It works against the idea that music making is about hierarchy, about experts and lay people, about professionals and hobbyists. Together we create pitch, time, and tom. And these things do not objectively exist outside of our performing them, right? So there is no such thing as real music, in other words. I'm going to play you an example of some highly discrepant music that is super funky, super groovy, super dancey, right? One of the interesting things about Charlie Kyle's theory is that it proved true, okay? What we're looking at is the ride tap of the drummer and the bass player. And if you look at those sine waves, they are not lining up on the 1, 2, and the 3. They are actually pushing and pulling at the pulse. They're not mathematically perfect, right? Same idea there, another bass line. Here we go, just a sample of this. I hope it's not too loud. Oh, look at that. You didn't see that? Ah, you didn't see it? is just not mathematical. And yet that's what we're loving here. We're loving the imperfection. You like that kind of music. Okay. So Charlie's theory is really, it's postmodern, and it was postmodern 20 years ahead of its time and 40 years before this movie. And postmodernism, in a way, is all about this kind of statement. And some of you don't know this reference, but, well, that's just like your opinion now. And that is the classic postmodern statement, and everything's relative, right? The takeaway message from those slides that I just showed is that Charlie argued that it's possible that no one would enjoy mathematically perfect music very much, and that perfect music may not exist. Anybody who knows a little philosophy understands how long some people have been obsessed with perfection, right? But what if the best music actually requires imperfection and bad math? What if the best music is about participation and inclusion of a variety of voices that are not all the same or equally skilled? What if cleanliness is not godliness, and what one needs are some germs to grow the communal immune system? What if people enjoy not quite perfect pitch better than perfect pitch? I want to make an important observation. So far, Charlie's points here are still about the sonic qualities of music, right? However, going to the next step, beyond such questions about how music sounds, Charlie proposed a different way to rank the value of particular musics for society. It wasn't about aesthetics, or the score, or notes. He evaluated whether or not the social requirements of the music were more or less egalitarian. He asked whether or not they promoted equality or inequality. He wanted to know who was invited to the party, who funded it, and who was not invited. He boldly asked what social structures are supported by what kinds of music, and he was willing to throw in his musical lot with the music of the oppressed, the funky, the groovy, and the people who designed their music so that imperfection could reign as the product of inclusive collective consciousness. He wanted to go to a bar where people would shout with joy, not to an opera where people would sit repressed and then release their tension upon command. If I were of Charlie's mind and a conspiracy theorist, and I'm probably not, and I'm not of Charlie's mind, I could imagine that really today a working class orchestra is generally funded by corporations and run by government dictators with military precision bent on colonization with a very limited repertoire. And that for Charlie, the jazz combo presents as a guerrilla anarchist response of improvised, innovative musical attack from local indigenous rebels. Right? So now that I've explained a little bit about the kind of theoretical perspective that informs my research, although not directly, and I don't have such strong feelings about classical music, though I do want to emphasize, Aaron, I want to combine that footing with a little bit of history that informs Hornby and the way that it is now. So I'm going to shift violently now to another subject. When one does a PhD, generally there are these things called comprehensive exams. And one must complete them before beginning the original research. They are like extra little mini master's degrees. And our program required 3 of them. The second comprehensive exam that I did provided some context for Hornby Island. So let's talk about the real old stock Canadian, old-timer, old families and varieties of Europeans on Hornby. In order to understand how the countercultural revolution in North America took place, in order to see how the hippies came to Hornby, one needs to go back to the original bra burners. The Protestant Reformation was the moment in time when Protestants broke from the Catholics in Europe. And so I'm grossly simplifying here, but the point is that in the 1500s, some European people were sick of the oppressive power of the Roman Catholic Church, and they rebelled against both its theocracy, its moral power, its value system, and its notion of an ethical life. These people essentially wanted to cut out the middleman and have a more direct relationship with God through religious fundamentalism, but also through social autonomy and self-determination and individuality. They were the off-grid dream of the 1500s. Okay? Things really heated up in Germanic countries and spread from there. Many of the North Americans' first European inhabitants were Protestants who just wanted to be left to their own so that they could farm the land free from the oppressive force of Rome. If you can imagine, okay, there was a time in the ancestry of Europeans when the Pope wielded power almost any and every aspect of one's cultural life. And this is a picture from an eyewitness to the killing of 25,000 Protestants in October by Catholics in Paris in 1572. So just as one moves from Ontario to the West Coast, or flees from the US draft, Protestant Europeans got in boats in the 1600s to become loggers, fishers, and oceanfront property managers on the East Coast, what was then the West Coast. And once they got here, after about 200 years of Puritan chastity and getting right with their God, right, before the railways, the slaughter of buffalo and the subjugation of indigenous peoples was complete. Was complete. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, some of these people began having multi-week festivals in the forests that they called revivals, because they felt they'd lost touch with their radical roots. They figured really things had gotten too lax, people were making too much money and sin in the New World, and so they wanted to recapture the spirit with which they had originally set out from Europe. Other commune-thriving colonist Protestants, like the Amish and Quakers, Mennonites and Hutterites, and even later the Doukhobors, they seemed secure in their identity and their societies. And instead of creating new ones, this is perfect. Instead of creating new ones in their new world through revivals, they transplanted and deepened their societies, where one can still visit today and learn to speak German dialects from the 1600s. So you with me there? I'm still talking about going to the Amish, and they came over. As far as I can tell, the lost sheep of these revivals did a lot of communal music making, dancing, and sexual experimentation with whatever means of intoxication they could get their hands on. Upstate New York was essentially this for a couple decades. Oh, sorry, was my reference to Base Coast too modern? I meant this. Woodstock in '69, the Summer of Love in California. In New York, in the 1800s, it was called the Burned Over District, which birthed utopian movements like the Mormons, the Shakers, the Millerites, the Oneida, the Rappists, and so many other groups that felt certain Christ would return and reward them for their communal farm-to-table ways. And if you think there's something weird about comparing Mormons to Hornbyites, it's just because you haven't seen Mormons flee oppression in the East, can vegetables, and make cider in groups. Essentially from that time, what we saw has been the gradual westward expansion of not only European colonization and good old capitalism, but pockets of the utopian movements of the European Protestant Reformation and Revival pushing out to the West Coast. These movements had very specific ideas about our ideal relationship with nature. They were all about our spiritual purity, and that included nature. They had complex dietary restrictions and Swiss tinctures. Eventually, the Gulf Islands gained a reputation as a place people could move to in order to live out further European ideals of the countercultural autonomy, well before the 1960s. Freedom from the bureaucratic and red tape wasteland of the East was promised. No building codes, raw milk. Swaintula on Malcolm Album was a totally autonomous Finnish communist settlement in the early 1900s, and their saunas are legendary. Brother 12 oversaw an impossibly strange mystic commune on Valdez Island. Am I saying that right? Yeah. Valdez Island in the 1920s with classical patriarchal insanity. These communes began around the time artists started coming to Hornby Island in the summers. Thanks to Gordon Payne, I know that Charles H. Scott, whose property I now rent, founded what would become the Emily Carr University of Art and Design. As Gordon told me, artists were many of Hornby's first summer tourists. And perhaps at this stage I risk telling you your own story, which you know better than I. So perhaps then I'd also like to point out that it's not like the Protestants fled Europe and all of the Protestants fled or never left. Note these early 20th century Germans gathered in the woods to sing songs, practicing yoga, fleeing military service for the California coast in 1917 to play lap steel guitar, spreading their vegetarian propaganda, stripping the sunbathe in geometric patterns, embracing their pagan druidism. Hornby's counterculture didn't magically appear. See, now I look up and I've lost my place. It came from faraway places, and those places have many of the seeds. These ideas about a pure and enlightened connection to nature have been used for good, but also for things as unimaginable as the Nazi Party's Darwinism, a fascination with nature and purity, and there's that word again, perfection. I hope you found a couple connections here between musical thought and environmental thought so far. The whole utopian thing is about trying to achieve perfection in the present, or perhaps in the afterlife. Utopianism is driven by a frustration with the conditions of the present. When people say that Hornby is a utopia, they may mean that things are perfect here. Or they could also be indicating that people in Hornby are frustrated with the conditions of the present and are actively working to achieve some kind of perfection. That working to achieve, that is an imperfect process. So do you see here? It's like a participatory discrepancy. When people are trying to create a groove and are most successful when they collectively allow for diversity. If Hornby is a utopia, and I'm not saying it is, it would be so because of the composite of imperfections, not because every single thing is ever, or any one, is individually perfect. And this is a very musical notion, that each person plays her or his part well enough to add to the whole. So if you're wondering just how this whole utopian history lesson connects with music making on Hornby and the problem of reproducing the whole utopian island vibe, then you're headed in the right direction. And if I've lost you, that's fine. We're about to change